Col Navarro had been staring at the same screen for 6 hours, and the screen had nothing interesting to show him. That was the job. That was always the job. He was a signal analyst on Bravo 9, one of the small deep space communication stations that humanity had quietly placed around the solar system over the last 40 years. Bravo 9 sat in orbit around Titan, Saturn's largest moon, and on most days it was one of the loneliest places a person could be while still technically being employed. The station had a crew of 11. Most of them were either asleep or pretending to be. The lights in the monitoring bay were kept low during the night cycle, and the hum of the air processors was so constant that most people stopped hearing it after the first week. Cole had stopped hearing it after the first hour of his very first shift, 3 years ago. Now he only noticed it when it changed pitch, which it almost never did. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the main display. It showed a long, quiet line. The line pulsed every 11 seconds, a small, regular bump that came and went like the slow breathing of something enormous and far away. That pulse was the Galactic Cooperative Relay Network. Nobody had built it. It had simply been there when humanity started listening, a deep space signal web so old and so vast that the scientists who first detected it in 2143 had spent 6 months arguing about whether it was natural or artificial. It was artificial. That much had been settled quickly. Who made it, and when, and how, those questions were still open. Humanity had never fully decoded the relay signals. They understood pieces, navigational data, what seemed to be timing references, fragments that looked like trade information from species whose names no living human knew. But they had been tapping the network quietly for 30 years, reading whatever they could, learning slowly, the way you learn a language by listening to it through a wall. The line pulsed. Cole made a small note in the daily log. The line pulsed again 11 seconds later. He made another note. This was his life. Then the line stopped. He sat up. He looked at the display for a long moment, waiting for the next pulse. It did not come. He checked the clock. 11 seconds passed. Then another 11. Then another. The line was flat and still. He assumed equipment failure. That was the reasonable assumption. He ran a hardware check and got clean results on everything. He restarted the receiver array and waited. The line stayed flat. Cole walked across the bay to the small side room where Lena Marsh worked. Lena was the station's lead astrophysicist. She was a quiet woman with a habit of reading 2 or 3 things at the same time, and she never looked especially surprised by anything, which Cole had always found either reassuring or unsettling depending on his mood. He told her what had happened. She came and looked at the display without saying anything. She ran her own diagnostics. Her results came back the same as his. Hardware was fine. The signal was simply gone. Pete Okafor came in from the communications room with a cup of something hot and looked at the two of them staring at the screen. Pete was the station's communications officer, an older man who had spent 12 years in the Navy before switching to deep space work, and he had a way of making anything sound less serious than it probably was. "Maybe they're on a break," he said. Cole did not laugh. Lena did not either. She pulled up the archive signal data going back 6 months and started comparing pulse intervals across time. Cole watched her work. Pete drank whatever was in his cup and stood nearby, not quite as relaxed as he was pretending to be. After about 20 minutes, Lena looked up. She said the silence had not started today. She had been looking at the historical data carefully, and the pulse strength had been declining very slightly for months, so slightly that the automated monitoring system had flagged nothing. The full silence was today, but the decay had been going on for a long time. And it had not started at Bravo 9's position. It had started from the outer galaxy, from the very far edge, and had been moving inward. Like a wave. Like something pressing through water, pushing the quiet ahead of it. Pete put his cup down. Cole asked how long ago it had started at the rim. Lena looked at her numbers. She said approximately 6 months ago, based on signal decay rate and the estimated distance involved. The three of them stood in the low light and looked at the flat line on the screen and did not say much for a moment. Cole wrote up a priority report and sent it to Earth. Standard protocol. Flag the anomaly, describe the diagnostics, request guidance. Earth was about an hour and 20 minutes away by signal at current orbital positions, so a response would realistically come in 3 to 4 hours, accounting for someone on the other end actually reading it and forming a reply. He sent it and went back to watching the dead line. 6 hours passed. Lena spent most of that time pulling star maps. She was looking at the galactic rim, at the regions where the relay decay had apparently started. Cole watched her work from across the room. She had the kind of expression that he had learned, over 3 years, meant she was thinking about something she did not yet want to say out loud. Pete went and came back and went again. He was the kind of person who dealt with tension by staying in motion. 18 hours after the signal died, Earth still had not responded. That was not unheard of. Priority reports sometimes got buried. The bureaucratic chain between Bravo 9 and anyone with authority to respond was long and had several places where things could slow down or get quietly deprioritized. Cole filed a follow-up and told himself it was fine. He sat down and looked at the flatline again. Outside the station's hull, Saturn hung in the dark with its rings catching pale light from the distant sun. Titan drifted below. Beyond that, beyond the outer planets, beyond the heliopause and the long empty reach between stars, the relay network that had been pulsing patiently for longer than human civilization had existed was no longer pulsing. Something had reached the edge of the galaxy 6 months ago. Whatever it had found there, it had not stopped moving. The silence had been traveling ever since, steady, patient, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone was listening for it. Lena finally spoke. She said she thought they should keep monitoring. She said it in a way that meant she was thinking something much larger than that, and had decided it was not yet time to say it. Cole agreed. He kept watching the screen. The line did not move. Dana Holt had not slept in 31 hours, and the coffee machine on the 4th floor of the Geneva International Space Authority building had been broken for 2 days, which she considered a personal attack. She sat at her desk surrounded by printed reports and open screens and the quiet kind of panic that looks, from the outside, like someone just working very hard. 3 automated distress relays had come in from alien ambassador proxy stations in the last week. Not distress in the dramatic sense. No alarms, no calls for help. Just the standard check-in signals that the proxies sent every 72 hours, and then the silence where the next check-in should have been. 3 proxies. 3 silences. Dana had flagged it up the chain 4 days ago. Nobody had yet told her what to do about it. Aaron Bex knocked on her open door and came in carrying a folder and a look on his face that she had come to recognize as his version of bad news. Aaron was young, still in his first year as a staff aide, and he had the unfortunate quality of being very good at finding things nobody wanted him to find. He put the folder on her desk. He told her he had gone back through the passive monitoring logs, not just the proxy stations but all of the deep background alien signal traffic that the authority had been quietly tracking for years. The stuff that was never formally studied, just recorded and stored. She opened the folder. She read the first page. She read it again. Over the last 6 months, every single source of alien signal traffic that humanity had ever detected had gone quiet. Not reduced. Not degraded. Gone. The great web of communication that had stretched across the galaxy and which humanity had been eavesdropping on for 3 decades. The trade signals, the navigational pings, the cultural broadcasts, the fragments of languages nobody had ever fully translated. All of it had stopped, piece by piece, starting from the outer rim and moving inward. Dana closed the folder and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she asked Aaron who else had seen this. He said nobody, as far as he knew. He had put it together himself from raw archive data, and he had come to her first. She told him not to share it yet. She needed to make a call. The call was to Caleb Wren. Caleb was 68 years old, had spent 40 years as an astronomer, and had officially been in a quiet advisory role for the last 3 years, which meant he came to about 1 meeting a month and otherwise did whatever he wanted. Dana had worked with him long enough to know that when Caleb went quiet, it was because he was sitting on something. He came in the next morning. He sat down across from Dana and Aaron and he looked at the folder and he let out a long breath through his nose, the way a person does when something they were hoping not to deal with has finally arrived at the table. He told them he had pieces of this picture. Not the full picture, not what Aaron had assembled, but pieces. He had been tracking the relay decay in certain sectors for 4 months. He had written a report. He had sent it to his direct supervisor. His supervisor had told him verbally to hold it and wait for guidance. Then that supervisor had been reassigned. The guidance had never come. Dana asked him what his report said. He told her the same thing the folder said, with 4 fewer months of data. Every civilization humanity had indirect contact with had gone silent. Not withdrawn, not gone to war, not deliberately cut contact. Just stopped. As though the act of communicating had simply become impossible for them. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Then Caleb said something that Dana wrote down and underlined. He said the silence was not random. It followed a clear path, always moving from the outer galaxy inward. Whatever had caused this had a direction and a pace. And based on the rate of spread, it would reach the regions near human space within a few months, maybe less. Aaron asked what exactly had caused it. Caleb said he did not know. He said none of the data explained the mechanism, only the effect. Meanwhile, on Bravo 9, Cole had been awake for most of the last 2 days. The flat line on the monitor had not changed. Earth had finally responded to his priority report, not with information, but with instructions. The message was terse and classified. It told the crew to continue monitoring and to avoid transmitting outward on any frequency. No reason was given. No context. Just the instruction. Pete read it twice and then asked out loud who exactly they were supposed to be avoiding upsetting, since every signal source out there had already gone quiet. It was a reasonable question. Nobody answered it. Cole looked at the instruction for a long time. He was a practical person. He understood that protocols existed for reasons, and that people further up the chain often had information that field crews did not. He respected that in an abstract way. Then he thought about the wave of silence moving inward from the rim. He thought about the fact that whatever was out there had apparently reached every known spacefaring species before anyone had managed to send so much as a warning. And he thought about the old first contact frequency, a specific radio band that humanity had used decades ago during its first cautious attempts to announce its presence to the galaxy. Simple, slow pulses, easy to detect, designed to say nothing more than, something here is alive and knows you might be listening. He sent a single low-power ping on that frequency. Outward. Short, clean, and quiet. Lena was at her station and did not look up. Pete was in the other room and later said he had been asleep, which was almost certainly not true. Cole sat and waited. For 3 hours, nothing came back. He was starting to think it had been a pointless impulse when the receiver made a sound he had not heard before, a soft, uneven tone that the system flagged as a return signal from a localized source. Not from deep space. Not from the galaxy's edge. From somewhere much closer, inside the outer solar system. He traced the source. The signal was coming from a transponder tag he nearly didn't recognize, because it belonged to a probe listed in the archives as lost. The Avery, a long-range explorer that had been sent toward the galactic mid-arm 11 years ago and had stopped transmitting 18 months into its mission. It had been written off, mourned briefly in a small article in a science journal, and forgotten. Its beacon was now active. Its logs were transmitting, slowly and in fragments, the way a damaged system sends data when it only has partial power. Cole started pulling the logs. The text data came first: position records, system status, automated observations. Then, after a few minutes, the visual files began to load. He sat forward in his chair. The images showed deep space, stars and dark and the long nothing between them. And then, in one sector where a mid-sized star should have been according to every map in the database, there was no star. Instead, there was something else. Large. Perfectly geometric. Sitting in the dark where a star used to be, with no light source of its own, visible only because of how it blocked everything behind it. It had been there for a while, according to the Avery's timestamps. It had been there long before anyone on Earth or Bravo 9 had started asking questions. Cole looked at it on his screen and did not move for a long time. Outside, Saturn's rings caught the pale light of a sun that was very far away. Somewhere beyond them, in the long dark between stars, something sat in the place where a sun had been and waited with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. Nora Ellis had spent 9 years of her life listening to alien noise that nobody else wanted to sit with long enough to understand. She worked out of a small office in the Geneva Authority building, 1 floor below Dana, and her job title was xenolinguist, which most people at the authority treated as a polite way of saying she worked on things that would probably never produce results. Nora did not mind this. She liked the quiet. She liked the slow, careful work of pulling meaning out of signals that were never designed for human ears. When Dana came down to her office and dropped a hard drive on her desk and asked her to go through every archived relay fragment the authority had ever collected, Nora did not ask why. She plugged in the drive and got to work. It took her 4 days. What she found was not hidden. It had always been there, in the oldest layers of the relay archive, signals that predated humanity's contact with the network by a significant margin, buried underneath decades of newer traffic the way old writing gets buried under new paint. Nobody had looked carefully at this material because there had always been newer, more active signals to chase. The old stuff was assumed to be dead background noise. It was not noise. The old signals were structured. They repeated in patterns. And when Nora began cross-referencing them against the fragments she had partially translated over the years, she found something that made her sit very still in her chair for a long time. They were warnings. Not warnings in the simple sense of danger ahead, turn back. These were detailed, careful, almost desperate messages that had been sent and resent across multiple frequencies by what appeared to be several different species, all describing the same thing. The words were different. Every species had its own language, its own symbols, but the meaning, when Nora traced it carefully through the overlapping layers, was consistent. Every translation pointed to the same concept. Something that moved through the galaxy. Something that did not destroy civilizations in the way that wars or disasters destroyed things. It did not burn or break. It simply reached into the most complex and connected parts of a civilization, its technology, its communication systems, its social structures, and unmade them. It took apart the things that held advanced life together, piece by piece, starting with the most sophisticated systems and working downward. The alien languages used different words for it. One species called it something that translated roughly as the silence that builds. Another used a phrase meaning the geometry that consumes order. A third, older set of signals used a single repeated symbol that Nora had seen before in other contexts but had never been able to place. She placed it now. It meant, as close as she could render it in English, the thing that cannot be counted. She printed everything and took it upstairs. Dana read through the translation summary with Ryan Castillo sitting beside her. Ryan was a military attaché who had been assigned to the crisis team 3 days earlier, a young man who had the useful quality of asking direct questions without embarrassment. When Dana finished reading, she passed the pages to Ryan. He read quickly. He asked when this thing had last come through. Nora told him. Based on the oldest warnings in the archive, the last pass had been approximately 80,000 years ago. Every civilization that was technologically advanced at the time had fallen silent in its wake. Species that had been primitive at the time of the pass, that were pre-contact, isolated, or simply had nothing complex enough to be taken apart, had survived. Some of them had eventually gone on to build the relay network themselves. Some of those were now among the species that had recently gone silent. Ryan sat with that for a moment. Then he asked the question Dana had been waiting for someone to say out loud. He asked what that made humanity. Nobody answered immediately. It was Nora who said it. She said that by every measure of galactic civilization, humanity was extremely young and extremely primitive. Spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. Technology that older species would consider basic and poorly integrated. A civilization spread across a single solar system with a handful of small outlying stations. Communication networks that were messy, redundant, and full of gaps. She said that to the thing in the archive warnings, humanity probably looked the way a small cluster of tents looks to something searching for cities. Ryan said that sounded almost like good news. Dana said she was not sure yet. She called in Owen Pratt that afternoon. Owen was 63, had commanded 3 deep space military vessels over a long career, and had retired 18 months ago to a house in coastal Maine where he was apparently very happy doing nothing. He came in from the airport still wearing the kind of clothes a person wears when they were not expecting a call. He sat down, looked at the briefing documents, and did not speak for several minutes. Then he asked the question that cut to the center of it all. He did not ask how to fight the thing. He asked what, specifically, it did when it arrived at a system, step by step, in order, beginning to end. Nora and Dana walked him through what the warnings described. It began with the most complex systems. Long-range communication networks were the first to go. Then planetary grids, advanced propulsion, energy infrastructure. Then, more slowly, social and governmental systems. The more interconnected and sophisticated a civilization's technology, the faster it collapsed. Simple systems lasted longer. Isolated systems lasted longer still. High redundancy, low interdependence, and basic mechanical backup systems appeared to slow the process significantly in a few documented cases. Owen listened to all of it without interrupting. When they finished, he leaned back and asked someone to pull up the technical specifications of human deep space stations and vessels. He went through the specs for about 20 minutes. Cole Station, Bravo 9, was in the database. So were the specs for the 6 other manned stations, the 4 active long-range vessels, the various automated relays, and the surface infrastructure on Earth and the Moon and the Mars settlements. Owen looked at the specs and then he smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that has no happiness in it, only a grim and private recognition. Human engineering had a well-known reputation across the Authority and the space program. It was over-engineered, over-redundant, built with backups for the backups, mechanical failsafes behind the electronic ones, hand-operated systems behind those. Early space disasters had driven a culture of deep caution into every design spec. Where older alien civilizations had built elegant, tightly integrated systems that ran beautifully and efficiently, human engineers had built clunky, decentralized, deliberately simple machines that did their jobs even when half their components failed. Other species, in the few cultural exchanges humanity had managed to establish, had found human technology charmingly unsophisticated. A little embarrassing. Like showing up to a formal event in work clothes. Owen closed the spec folder and told Dana that their work clothes might be the only reason anyone in this building was still standing. Back on Bravo 9, Cole had spent 2 days pulling visual logs from the Avery probe. System after system showed the same thing, the remnants of civilizations that had simply stopped. No wreckage, no signs of conflict. Ships sitting still in orbit. Stations dark. Planets quiet. The infrastructure still physically present but completely inert, like a clock that had been running perfectly and then, for no visible reason, simply ceased to tick. Cole sat in the low light of the monitoring bay and looked at image after image. Stars he had no names for. Structures he had no words for. And in each image, in the middle of all that vast and beautiful complexity, the same total and complete silence. Lena came and stood beside him. She looked at the screen for a while. Then she said, quietly, that every species out there had built something extraordinary, and that every extraordinary thing had apparently been exactly the right size and shape to be taken apart. Cole did not answer. He kept looking at the images. Outside the station, the dark between the stars was very large, and getting, in some hard-to-measure way, a little larger every day. Paige Drum had flown a lot of things in her career. Survey ships, cargo haulers, a research vessel with a broken heating system that she had kept running for 3 months with wire and stubbornness. She had never been asked to fly something that had been deliberately made worse before departure. But that was exactly what had happened to the Galloway. The Galloway was a mid-range survey vessel, 9 crew, originally fitted with a full modern navigation suite and a pair of advanced long-range communicators. Owen's team had spent 2 days stripping it before Paige and her crew were allowed to board. The advanced nav suite was replaced with an older, slower, mechanical backup system. The long-range communicators were swapped for a set of short-range units with manual frequency controls. The automated repair systems were pulled out entirely. In their place, the equipment bay was stocked with hand tools, spare wire, battery lanterns, and a crank-operated power backup that looked like something from 50 years ago. Paige stood in the equipment bay and looked at all of this and said, loudly, several things that were not suitable for a formal report. Luke Farrow, her second, listened to all of it and then handed her a cup of coffee and told her he understood the reason for it and thought it was actually quite smart. Paige told him she did not care how smart it was. He told her he knew. They boarded the ship. Owen's briefing had been clear. The Galloway was heading to a way station at the Galactic Midarm, a structure that Nora had identified in the Avery's logs as still intermittently broadcasting a low signal, which meant it had not fully gone dark yet. The mission was simple on paper. Get there, find the archive, pull whatever data remained, and come back. The stripped-down systems were not a punishment. They were the point. The simpler the ship, the less there was for the phenomenon to work on. Fly dumb, Owen had said. As dumb as you possibly can. The Galloway left the solar system on a cold morning by station clock, and for the first 2 weeks the trip was uneventful in the grinding, uncomfortable way that long space travel tends to be uneventful. Then, on the 15th day, the lights flickered. It was brief. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The primary power display dipped, the screens went grey, and then everything came back. The crew sat very still for a moment. Luke ran a diagnostic. Every system read normal. No fault, no quasi, no explanation. Paige told everyone to go to manual backup on anything that had a manual backup. Nobody argued. Over the next 4 days the flickering happened 6 more times. Each time it was brief. Each time the diagnostics showed nothing. Each time the manual and mechanical systems held without any issue whatsoever, completely unaffected, running the way simple things run when nothing about them is interesting enough to bother with. The crew complained about the battery lanterns and the hand crank backup and the slow old navigation system. Paige let them complain. She also noticed that none of them stopped using the manual systems after they switched over. On the 19th day, they reached the way station. It was old. Much older than anything humanity had built. It hung in the dark between stars like a piece of architecture that had been placed there before Earth had complex life and had simply been sitting quietly ever since. Parts of it were dark. Parts of it still had faint light moving through what might have been windows, though it was hard to be sure. The signal Nora had identified was coming from deep inside the structure, slow and irregular, like a heartbeat from something mostly but not entirely gone. Paige docked the Galloway against an exterior port that still, against all reasonable expectation, accepted the manual docking connection on the first try. She took Luke, Ben Ashworth, and 2 others inside. Ben was not a pilot or an engineer. He was a philosopher and ethicist who had been assigned to the mission after he had spent 3 weeks doing nothing at Geneva HQ except reading every piece of alien cultural archive the Authority had on file. Dana had put him on the crew list because Nora had insisted, and Nora had insisted because she said the archive at the way station would need someone who understood context, not just data. Paige had read his file and thought he seemed like exactly the wrong kind of person to bring on this kind of trip. He had surprised her twice already. Inside the way station, the air was thin but breathable, filtered by systems that were still running on what must have been an extraordinarily patient power source. The crew moved through wide, low-ceiling corridors with their lanterns on, past walls covered in symbols and diagrams that none of them could read. Ben walked slowly, looking at everything. Luke walked faster, looking for the archive signal source. They found the archive room after about 40 minutes. It was a large space filled with storage structures that still had faint active lights running along their edges. In the center of the room, one terminal was broadcasting, slowly, weakly, but consistently. Luke connected their portable translation rig to the terminal. The data began to transfer. It was slow. They sat in the dark and waited. The species that had built this place were called the Verati, according to the file headers. Nora had mentioned them in her briefing. They had survived 3 weeks longer than any other civilization during the phenomenon's last pass, 80,000 years ago. 3 weeks was not a long time, but it was long enough that they had apparently spent those 3 weeks doing something other than simply waiting. They had been studying, watching, recording everything they could. The Verati's final logs came through in fragments over the next 2 hours. Most of it was observational data, detailed records of how the phenomenon behaved, what it targeted first, how fast it moved through different types of systems. But near the end of the logs, in what appeared to be the last entries before the Verati went silent, there was something different. A theory. Ben read it first, because he read faster than the others. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he read it again. Then he looked up and said he needed everyone to listen carefully. The Verati had observed that the phenomenon operated by reading complexity. It found structured, organized systems and it worked through them the way a fire works through dry wood, following the connections, spreading along the pathways, consuming the order that held advanced technology and advanced civilization together. The more connected and logical a system was, the faster it fell. But the Verati had noticed something. In 3 cases, 3 small, isolated pockets that had survived longer than anything else, the common factor was not simplicity of technology. It was something else. Those pockets had been generating signals that were, by any analytical measure, completely chaotic. Not broken signals. Not random noise. Organic, living chaos, the kind that comes from many different sources broadcasting in many different ways with no central coordination and no unified pattern. The phenomenon could not read chaos. It could not find the structure it needed to work on if the signal environment around it was too complex and too disorganized to parse. In those 3 pockets it had slowed, stuttered, and eventually moved around them rather than through them. The Verati had tried to replicate this. They had designed a broadcast system meant to generate artificial chaos across multiple frequencies. The system had been logical, well-designed, and carefully engineered. It had not worked. Because it was, under everything, still orderly, still structured, still readable. Manufactured chaos, however good the design, still had a pattern underneath it. And the phenomenon had found the pattern. The last line of the Verati logs said simply that they had run out of time to try again. Ben closed the translation file. The room was quiet. Then he said something that made Luke put down his tools and Paige stop checking her watch. He said he had spent 3 weeks reading alien cultural archives. He had read economic records, social history, communication logs, public broadcasts. And in all of that material, across every species he had studied, there was nothing that came close to the sheer organic, uncoordinated, self-contradicting noise that human civilization produced every single day without trying. Humanity did not broadcast. It argued. It advertised. It sent emergency signals on the same frequencies as entertainment programs. It transmitted in dozens of languages simultaneously, often about completely different things, often contradicting itself, often at the same time as 6 other things were being transmitted about something unrelated. It produced art next to shipping data, next to political debate, next to sports commentary, next to someone's experimental music project. It had never once managed to produce a unified signal because it had never once managed to fully agree on anything. The variety had needed chaos and had not been able to make it because they were, at their core, too organized, too rational, too structured a species. Humanity had been producing exactly what was needed, completely by accident, for 200 years. Paige looked at Ben for a long moment. Then she picked up the radio and called Cole on Bravo 9. He answered on the second call. She told him to listen. She read him the key parts of the variety file, slowly and clearly. There was a long silence on the other end when she finished. Then Cole said he understood. He said he needed to make some calls. Paige looked around the dim, ancient room, at the walls covered in the careful, desperate work of a species that had figured out the answer too late, and felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not quite hope. Something harder than hope. Something that felt more like the moment before you commit to a thing you know is going to be very difficult and do it anyway. She told her crew to pack up the equipment. They had what they came for. It was time to go home. Tara Voss had run the Earth Global Broadcast Authority for 11 years, and in that time she had been asked to do many strange things. She had coordinated emergency frequency shutdowns during solar storms. She had managed the messy political process of reallocating signal bands between competing governments. She had once spent 3 weeks mediating a dispute between a private entertainment network and a military communications division over 17 megahertz of spectrum that both of them considered essential. She had never been asked to do anything like this. Owen sat across from her in the small conference room and explained it plainly. He did not dress it up. He told her what the phenomenon was, what it did, what the variety had found, and what Ben and Paige had brought back from the way station. He told her that the leading edge of the phenomenon was now estimated to be weeks away from the outer boundary of human-occupied space. He told her that the only thing that had ever slowed it, even briefly, was organic and uncoordinated signal chaos produced by a living civilization that did not know it was producing anything useful. Then he told her what he needed her to do. Every transmitter under the authority's coordination, surface arrays on Earth, the Moon, the Mars settlements, every deep space relay station, every manned vessel with a broadcast antenna, was to transmit simultaneously. Not a coordinated message. Not a warning or a declaration or a unified signal of any kind. Everything. All at once. Every frequency the equipment could reach. News programs and weather reports and sports commentary and shipping manifests and music and political arguments and emergency test tones and hobbyist radio transmissions and children's educational content and whatever else was currently sitting in any broadcast queue anywhere on the network. All of it. Full power. Pointed outward. Tara looked at him for a long moment. She asked if he was serious. He told her he was. She asked if this was actually going to work. He told her honestly that he did not know, but that a species 80,000 years ago had believed it would and had not been wrong about anything else in their final records. Tara picked up her phone and started making calls. It took 4 days to coordinate. 4 days of arguments and bureaucratic friction and governments that wanted assurances nobody could give and network administrators who thought the plan sounded like a technical disaster. Tara pushed through all of it with the focused energy of someone who had decided to stop being afraid and start being useful. She called in every favor she had. She made promises she was not entirely sure she could keep. She did not sleep more than 4 hours on any of the 4 nights. By the 5th day, the network was ready. On Bravo 9, Cole had not left the monitoring bay in 2 days. Lena was beside him. Pete was at the communications board, headset on, running the station's own broadcast array through the final checks. The Galloway was back inside the solar system, positioned in the outer reach near the heliopause, serving as the relay anchor between Bravo 9 and the mid-arm. Paige was at the helm. Ben was sitting in the back of the ship doing what he had done since they left the way station, reading, thinking, and being very quiet. The phenomenon arrived at the outer edge of human space on a Tuesday, station time, which Cole thought was an unremarkable day for something this large to happen. He saw it first on the passive sensors, a slow distortion in the background signal field, a kind of pressure in the data that the instruments did not have good language for. It was not visible. It was not loud. It was simply present, the way cold is present in a room before you can say exactly when it arrived. The first things it touched were the outermost stations. A small automated weather monitoring buoy at the very edge of the heliopause flickered on Cole's board. Its signal dipped, steadied, dipped again, and then held. A one-person research outpost on a long survey orbit sent a garbled status report and then a cleaner one a minute later. The systems were struggling. The simple ones were holding. Cole called Tara's office. Her aide answered and said she was ready and waiting for his word. He looked at Lena. She was watching the sensor board with the same expression she had worn since the night the relay signal first went flat, calm, focused, and carrying something heavy behind her eyes that she had chosen not to put down. He told the aide to go. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that battles are dramatic. There was no flash of light, no explosion, no moment of obvious triumph. What happened was noise. The full broadcast began from Earth first, because Earth had the largest arrays. It rolled outward at the speed of light, a wall of uncoordinated, overlapping, completely chaotic human signal traffic that carried within it every argument and advertisement and announcement and piece of music and burst of laughter and emergency frequency test and cooking program and financial report and political speech that humanity happened to be transmitting in that moment. Mars added its voice a few minutes later. The lunar arrays joined. The deep space stations came online one by one, each adding its own local traffic to the expanding wave. The Galloway, sitting at the outer edge of the system, opened every antenna it had and broadcast whatever it could pull from its own archives. Years of stored human signal traffic, playing simultaneously, all at once, pointed at the dark. Cole watched the sensor board. The pressure he had been tracking, the slow, sourceless distortion that the phenomenon pushed ahead of itself, did not stop immediately. It continued moving inward for what felt like a very long time but was, by the clock, about 40 minutes. Then it slowed. The slowing was subtle at first, the kind of change you could convince yourself you were imagining. Then it became measurable. Then unmistakable. The phenomenon was encountering something it could not read. For 6 hours, Cole did not leave his chair. He watched the board. He drank water that Pete put in front of him without being asked. Lena narrated what she was seeing in the data, quietly and steadily, the way she narrated everything, without drama, without the kind of hope that breaks apart if you hold it wrong. Just the facts, as clearly as she could state them. The leading edge of the phenomenon began to lose its shape. The geometric coherence that the Avery's logs had shown, that vast, perfect, patient structure sitting in the dark, began to show irregularities. Gaps in the pattern. Places where the thing that unmade ordered systems could find no order to begin working on, because the signal environment around it was too loud, too conflicting, too alive, and too human to offer any foothold. Over the following hours it shifted. Not backward. It did not retreat. It moved sideways, angling away from the dense wall of noise, finding the path of least resistance the way any force does when it meets something it cannot pass through. It moved around human space the way a river moves around a stone that is not large or impressive but is simply, stubbornly, in the way. By the end of the 6th hour, the sensor readings near the outer boundary had stabilized. The pressure was still there, still present, but no longer advancing. The outpost signals were clear. The weather buoy was transmitting normally. The one-person research station sent a status report that was perfectly clean. Cole sat back in his chair. He looked at the board for a long time. Pete said something under his breath that was not quite a word and not quite a sound and meant everything. Lena pulled up a new display, not the sensor board, but the passive long-range receiver array, the one the station used to quietly listen to the deep dark without transmitting anything back. She let it run for a while. Then she turned up the gain and told Cole to listen. He leaned in. Through the background static, beneath the retreating edge of the phenomenon and the continuing wall of Earth's broadcast noise, there were signals. Faint, fragmented, and irregular. Not human signals. Not the old relay network, which was still silent. Something else. Small sources, widely scattered, sending out careful and tentative transmissions the way a person in the dark calls out softly to see if anyone is there. Survivors. Not many. Not loud. But present. Cole listened to them for a while without speaking. Back on Earth, Tara's office had expected to power down the full broadcast network once the crisis passed. Nobody had given that order. Owen had not given it. Dana had not given it. Nobody with the authority to stop it had picked up the phone to do so. And so the transmitters kept broadcasting. All of them, all the noise, all the argument and music and news and sports and everything else that humanity produced without thinking about it, pointed outward into the dark in every direction. Not a weapon anymore. Just a sound. A light in the window. A fire kept burning so that anyone out in the cold who was trying to find their way might have something to walk toward. The galaxy had gone quiet overnight. Thousands of voices that had spoken across the stars for longer than humanity had words were simply gone, and nothing was going to bring them back quickly or easily. The scale of that loss was not something any one person could hold in their mind all at once. It would take time, a great deal of time, to understand what had been lost and what, if anything, could be rebuilt. But in a small monitoring bay orbiting Titan, Col Navarro sat in the low light and listened to faint signals calling out from the dark, and thought about the Verati in their final weeks, careful, brilliant, running out of time, and about a species in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy that had survived not because it was powerful or ancient or wise, but because it had never once managed to be quiet. He thought that was, all things considered, a very human way to save the world. Outside the station, Saturn's rings caught the light of the distant sun. The stars were still there. Some of them, somewhere behind their silence, still had people around them who were afraid and reaching out and hoping something would reach back. Earth kept broadcasting. It always did.